In this video, I will be explaining about the life cycle methods. So, life cycle methods are basically used in class-based components, and they are associated with the phases of life cycles, phases of the life cycles. So there are initially three phases of life cycle methods, life cycles. Like the first is the mounting phase, then is the updating phase, and then is the unmounting phase. So according to these phases, there are some associated methods, life cycle methods, which do some specific task on each of these phases. So firstly, about the mounting phase, there is component did mount method. So component did mount method does is that whenever in the initial mounting phase, when the component is mounted onto the screen, what happens is that if the screen if that component did mount will be invoked after that render, and that component is being rendered. So it is basically used, component did mount is basically used to like do the API calls. I have used it to do API calls if I was using the class based components. Like if the component is mounted and the API call, then what is the necessary need there is to do the API calls and show the data onto that component. So in that point, data is being fetched, with the help of component did mount. Next on, there is the updating phase. The phase one is mounting, then the second one is updating phase. So in the updating phase, what happens is our component is re-rendered, and before re-rendering, there are two methods associated with it. Like firstly, the method is should component update. So in should component update, there are it takes two arguments basically. So those two arguments will be like the next props and the next state. So the next props and the next state, what they do is like in that updating phase, should component update does is that it checks like if the current state and the next state which is coming, if there is any difference, what task should be done, like what is to be done at that phase, what things should be rendered, and onto that specific detailing which we said, like whatever the changes are there, so that changes are done to the done to the UI. And like after that method, the render is called and those certain changes are done. After that, there is one more method, component did update. In component did update, we take two arguments and we take an extra argument. We can take an extra argument, that is snapshot. Basically it is coming from one another method that is deprecated method nowadays. But like in the component did update, there are two methods basically which are important, that is previous state and the previous prop. So what these methods do is when the updating of that method is done and the rendering is done, what happens is whenever we have to perform some side effects based on those new things, based on those new props and state, we have to perform some side effects onto that UI. So that task is being done onto that inside of that method. And then comes the last phase. In the last phase, it is the unmounting phase. So in the unmounting phases, like it's kind of a death of the component, where the component is unmounted from the screen, and it has one associated method, that is component will unmount. So in component will unmount method, what happens is in component will unmount, what happens is there is the cleanup of in that like that component might have so many event listeners attached to it and multiple things, so our timers attached to it. So it is important to clean up those timers and clean up those event listeners. So that task is basically done inside of that method to clean up those event listeners. Otherwise, like it is a computational loss also if the component is unmounted and we are doing some like some event listeners are still attached to some that component, है ना? And so it is very hectic situation. So cleanup is also necessary, and that method does that. So this is about the life cycle methods, and what are the life cycle methods is associated with each of the phases.